Hello and welcome to today's webinar titled How Jobvite Masters Microservices in the Cloud with Harness and AppDynamics. My name is Alyssa Sarmiento and I'm part of the webinar team here at AppDynamics. I'm joined today by two very special guest speakers. We have our customer, Ron Teeter from Jobvite, as well as one of our partners, Steve Burton from Harness. A few housekeeping items before we get started. First, I am obligated to share this legal notice slide, so here's that, and now we'll continue on. Moving on, note that the console you are looking at is completely customizable. Feel free to explore the widgets at the bottom of your screen. You can also move or resize any of the windows you see open by dragging the bottom right corner. For the best viewing experience, we recommend using a wired internet connection and closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background that could cause issues. Webinars can be bandwidth intensive, so closing any unnecessary browser tabs will help conserve your bandwidth. If you have done these things and are still experiencing issues, whether it's with sound or the screen seems frozen, please refresh your browser, as I will usually fix any console issues. And if you continue to have issues, please reach out to us through the Q&A widget that's on the left side, and I'll try to help out there. And speaking of the Q&A widget, we invite you to submit any questions you have during the webinar through there, and we'll answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. For whatever reason, if we are not able to answer your question live, we will definitely answer offline. And lastly, this webinar will be recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording by the end of the day. Feel free to share the recording with your colleagues. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Ron.
Thank you, Alyssa. Good morning. My name's Ron Teeter, as covered. I'm Chief Architect at Jobvite, and I've been there for about 4.5 years. And one of the things that we have been doing is transforming our hosting infrastructure across multiple concerns. And this is an important topic for me personally because I think there are a lot of companies that are similar to Jobvite. You were founded well before the innovation wave that's currently state of the art. And now you're in a position where you're trying to catch up and adopt those technologies in a way that's cost effective. And so I wanted to share some of our hard-fought learnings with the wider audience. A little bit about myself. I come from a very varied background. I've been doing IT and software for over 35 years. I started in finance at a bank. I moved into aerospace. Yes, my degree is in aerospace and astronautics. I am a rocket scientist. I then moved into entertainment and communications with the shutdown in the space race in the early 90s, and moved into performance monitoring at Candle Corporation. I've done supply chain and global trade with Appian, and now I'm at Jobvite doing recruiting. And one of the things that this experience gives me is I've worked with everything from financial applications on mainframes to fluid dynamics calculations on supercomputers to programming calculators and monitoring websites. And it gives me a unique perspective across a number of software domains. Jobvite is the leading SaaS platform for recruiting in the marketplace, and we've got over 1,700 customers. Over 50,000 recruiters use our solution every day. We've got 64 million candidates in the system at any one time. We're pulling in over 60,000 applications a day. The platform is busy. We have some reasonable amount of scale, but we also have a very wide-ranging feature set, and that gives us a perspective where I think it's valuable to have this discussion. Jobvite initiated a transition from monolithic to microservice architecture about 4 years ago. And it really was driven by a need to solve some very challenging performance and scales issues as we grew as a company. providing this kind of service to a growing user population was taxing the limit of the earlier architecture. So when you think about how you might do a transformation like this, there's companies that will plan it out and they'll execute using a lot of capital to make a transition, and they'll do it quickly. There are companies that will say, we can't do that. We don't have capital. We can't move on to the new infrastructure. Jobvite was kind of in between these 2 points, and we chose to take a different path, which was we're going to do it, and we'll do it within our budget constraints. And we'll do it by doing it in a very pragmatic fashion, iteratively, driven by what the service needs rather than a purist vision of what it should be when it's all finished. That took a lot of planning and execution around how will we run in a hybrid architecture for an unknown amount of time, right? There's a commitment, a belief that you can do this and you can get through to the end. What was interesting is we started with a service model, which I'll get to in a minute. And by the time we were starting to roll that out, the industry had moved on to microservices. So then we started adopting microservices. But before even that finished, the industry moved on to serverless. And so it's become clear to me that the innovation of the industry is going to continue down this path. And so your strategy needs to follow that. You can't plan to finish something in a long term on the same technology that you started with. You either do it fast, you don't do it, or you do it along this path where it's pragmatic, and you adopt new technologies as they become available. So how does the hybrid architecture look today? Jobvite has 23 macroservices. These are non-monolithic applications that are not fully decomposed, but individually hosted and scaled. And we have 22 microservice components, which are single domain of concern and in a traditional microservice isolation. We've got over 1 million lines of code in multiple technologies, and we have a variety of data sources encompassing over 30 terabytes of data. So let's talk about our journey, right? Jobvite's been around since 2005. It's now 2018. That's 13 years of transition, 13 years of feature development, delivering value to customers. But in those 13 years, the industry has transitioned across multiple waves of innovation. And one of the things that Jobvite's journey has included is dealing with more than one of them at the same time. We had a monolithic application design, we had a monolithic database design, and we were hosted on-premise. Today, we are a hybrid microservice and service-oriented application, distributed databases in a cloud environment. That's a fairly significant journey to take. And most of the transition has happened in the last 6 years. And part of why we're talking today is about how Jobvite was able to make those transitions and how we were able to do so quickly and cost effectively. At the end of the day, this journey, the priority here was to achieve more velocity. As you look at the items that the team has delivered over the years, you can see the velocity occur. Two main innovations that led for this was the transition to the cloud from on-prem, which you can see occurred over the 2013 to 2014 timeframe. We were able to move our entire infrastructure in about 6 months once we understood what being in the cloud meant for us. The other transition is transitioning from .NET to Java and from monolithic to microservice. Also gave us a lot of velocity. We'll edit this. So let's talk about how our CI/CD pipeline looked like prior to our microservices. We have a dedicated release team with manual verifications, lots of ad hoc scripts that have to be maintained and written by people who are not the engineers of the application, but they're typically operations staff. Releases are an event. We plan for them. You schedule them. You build checklists. You walk through the checklists. And at the end of the day, this requires a lot of overhead and expense, and so you tend to release infrequently. For us, a 6-week release cycle is about right. Before, we have to build tools to support this release cycle, and it requires a lot of in-house development. One of the things that was interesting to me as I was thinking about this problem this spring on how to communicate some of our needs to our tooling partners was walking through how we build our product, right? Commit, build, deploy, test, promote. That's fairly standard SDLC for many companies for their products. But then you also need to apply the same logic to your hosting infrastructure if you're doing infrastructure as code. Well, if your infrastructure is code, then it should be treated the same as your product as code. For me, the next leap was all of my SDLC automation should also be code, and it should also go through the same life cycle. What is production for our customers is the ultimate outcome of all of this process, but to my engineering team, the SDLC automation is a production service, and it also needs to be stable, and it also needs to be performant. At Jobvite, we observed that a lot of the issues that we were seeing in the delivery process were actually caused by variances in the environment configurations. So as we went about reconciling that, we made an additional choice to install a DevOps culture within R&D. Break down the walls between engineering and operations that led to some of the confusion and led to some of the chaos. For us, the transition was intentful. It started by design with a few key core concepts, and those were ruthless standardization across environments. One thing that we've observed is it's quite common in the upstream environments to share resources between this environment and that environment because the resources are expensive. They take time and effort to create and maintain. That creates more problems than it solves. And since your opportunity cost is your employees' time, sometimes the expense is quite worth it. Convention over configuration. There are a lot of good tools for managing configuration, but at the end of the day, not having to manage the configuration is still simpler and easier to reproduce. Choosing to deploy services over servers. Partnering with companies that are best in breed to do something that you want to do rather than try to run the service yourself that does the same thing. Stick to your core competencies. Our motto is borrow or buy before we build. And then automation, automation, automation. I can't say enough about how differentiating automation can be to your objective. Once Jobvite had established its DevOps culture, our first project was to replace all of our infrastructure across our development, QA, staging, and production environments using the tool set that we built This involved engineering working in production with infrastructure as code. The second step was to look at our SDLC process itself and say, how do we take the next step here? We have a variety of point solutions, but they were not integrated. So integrating that tool chain to increase our visibility and provide better insights into the state of the process while it's in flight was the next priority. We broke this into continuous integration, continuous deployment in the typical sides, but at Jobvite, it's really about a vision of continuous quality. So whether it's source control, testing, builds, deployment, verification, performance monitoring, it all has to go in a single place. And this is something that we've got a limited capability now and are continuing to expand going forward. So let's talk about Harness for a moment. For us, it's really about the transparent deployment automation. Knowing what is happening in real time, knowing where the problems are in real time is a lifesaver for a development team. Advanced verification process. This is the key feature that Steve will talk about later that really glued me into Harness a year ago when we started working with them. Being able to get the automated insights into how is it going was a tremendous time saver for us. And of course, the last and sometimes most important feature is the automated remediation. Being able to declare whether or not you want a certain failure condition to cause a rollback or not allows you to choose to leave broken builds in place in Dev, so Dev can investigate why it's a broken build, but roll it back in QA in the downstream environments so that you're not blocking other people's progress. So let's talk about the Harness continuous deployment use case. At Jobvite, we have microservices deployments as shown here on the screen that are multi-phase. We're automating code deployments on top of EC2 instances, and then we have integrated verification with AppDynamics and Elk. You can see when the deployment is running, you get real-time feedback from code deploy. You get to see how the analyses are running. And then ultimately, if there's a problem, as shown here, you can actually zero in on where the problem is and get the immediate feedback from the tool itself. On the continuous verification front, Harness provides both a timeline history of all of the builds that have run and how each of the microservice deployments went with each build and deployment, and you have one-click drill down into the rationale for why a particular item failed. On the automatic remediation front, Harness provides the ability to configure in certain condition checks to have specific results. You can roll back, you can leave a broken build, you can choose to notify or not notify. This flexibility is incredibly valuable when you have a variety of microservice deployments that are being managed by different team members. Now let's talk about AppDynamics a little bit. We've been using AppDynamics to guide our service decomposition for several years now. As I said before, it's a journey, not a destination. So we use the performance and load metrics from AppDynamics to guide which microservices to break out next and what the performance objectives need to be to ensure that they're going to be deployed successfully to production. We're now, with Harness, able to actually use AppDynamics for performance regression detection in the build integration environment. That means we don't need to wait until the code gets to production to see that there's a problem in a performance use case. With AppDynamics as an application monitoring service, The response time metrics are invaluable. And there are a couple of different ways that you can approach this. And even our thinking has advanced over the years. We used to use the average response time, average number of applications per day. And when thinking about it and looking at some of the data that we were getting out of AppDynamics, it became clear that average is good for most customers, but it's not good enough. And so we started thinking about where we should be thinking about our performance metrics being bound. Where should the requirement, where should the goal be? And we chose to use the 95th percentile internally going forward, and mainly because no customer wants to be average. No one wants to be a statistical outlier. And to try and get my point across with the team inside, and I'll share it with you today, I came up with a really terrible, groan-worthy pun. So you've been warned. Using the average is just mean. Now that you've recovered from the terrible pun, let's talk about what the benefits of the supply chain are. Previously in our CI/CD, we took 3 to 5 engineers, about 30 minutes to do a deployment, 2 hours to do a verification in Dev and QA. And then we have a different process for production. And having different processes is part of the problem. So what we wanted to do is say, can we change this? Can we make this process more streamlined, more automated, and eventually make the process the same end to end? And so once we've got AppDynamics and Harness in place, we've already started seeing some major benefits. Today, 1 engineer, 2 minutes to do deployment, 15 minutes to do verification. That's a marked improvement with minimal effort. This is why having the tooling and the automation is so crucial. That way you can spend your time working on the application itself. Now I'm going to let Steve talk for a moment about some of the specific features within Harness.
Thanks, Ron, for the great story. Hi, everyone. I just want to walk through some kind of features we've created with AppDynamics, specifically for microservices. So you can see the first thing you see here is the deployment workflow, where we're going to automate the deployment process. And we're actually going to then connect to AppDynamics once there's a deployment. And this is where machine learning can analyze the data sets within AppDynamics. What we've actually done with AppDynamics is built a deep integration so that when we deploy a new artifact or service, we can query the AppDynamics service model, and I can say, right, tell me the upstream and the downstream microservices that may be impacted by the artifact that I'm deploying. And then what we can do is we can go ahead and we can use the machine learning to look at the performance, the throughput, and the errors, but not just the service we're deploying, but the upstream and downstream services. So we're actually understanding all of the dependencies and what the impact is of the deployment. That's been very valuable for a lot of customers like Jobvite that have tens of microservices in a production environment. Also, we have a concept called microservices flow control. So obviously what you want to do, if you're deploying multiple services at the same time, you need those services to be up and running before you verify, you validate the services. So in the case of what you see here on the screen, you've got tens of microservices, and you want all of the deployment workflows to reach a certain step. Once all have reached a certain step, you then want to verify collectively the performance and the throughput of those microservices. And we enable that in Harness using a concept called barriers. You can put barriers in a workflow, and the sequence of execution will reach these barriers, and it'll wait until all of the microservice deployments have reached the same state. Then it will complete the verification exercise there. For more information, you can go to Harness.io. You can read the blogs. All of our specifically customer success stories, including Jobvite and the AppDynamics feature sets that Ron walked through, are all available there. Now I'm going to hand it back to Alyssa, and we can kick off a Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Ron, for your great presentation. So this does take us to the Q&A portion of the event. We'll answer as many as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. We do already have a few in the queue that came in during the webinar, but please feel free to continue submitting any questions that you think of. And if for whatever reason we run out of time or we're not able to answer your question live, we'll definitely reach out offline to ensure that you get the answers that you need. So of course, we have Ron, who can answer any questions that you guys have around his experience. Steve is here to answer any questions more specific to Harness, and we also have Tom Batchelor here from AppDynamics to answer anything AppD specific. So with that, I will get started on some of the questions that have come through. So Ron, this one's for you. What's your team planning on doing next?
Well, that one's fairly straightforward. If you go back to the DevOps toolchain vision slide, that's really where we're focused right now. We're continuing to work on the build out with the other vendors that we work with to get it fully integrated. And then next steps are then to work on a new hosting model that's based on Kubernetes. So that's going to be the next iteration of our infrastructure as code. And then we'll see where our journey continues from there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Ron. And then taking a step back, how did you get started? How did you get to where you are now?
Okay. Yeah, so the challenge that we ran into is because we were still operating in a very data center-centric model, we had a fairly sizable technical operations team, and they were having to do a lot of work by hand. We were using Jira to track the work orders between environments, and it became apparent that there was simply too much ask for what the team could do. And we recognized that automation was the path forward to solve that. But beyond that, the needing to democratize the workload, if an engineer can write code and can write a build file and can write a test file, why can't they write their own infrastructure that's required as well? And so that really was the inspiration to move to a DevOps model. Obviously we still need skill sets from both experience paths, whether it's coding or whether it's system architecture. And so we actually merged the teams together and got them co-working together. Tearing down that wall between operations and engineering is what enabled us to be successful. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ron. So there's a few questions that came through, mostly just asking if a recording will be available of this, and the answer is yes. For those who missed the intro where I did mention it, you will get a copy, you'll get an email with a link to the recording by tomorrow at the latest, and you'll be able to share that link with anybody on your team if you wanted to. Okay, moving on, this next question will be for Tom. So how does AppDynamics specifically help with microservices?
Great question, thank you. So I'll touch on just a couple of quick highlights. As you're going through any re-architecture of an application, one of the key things we want to do is make sure we don't start to introduce issues or introduce problems. Leveraging our transaction detection and our baselining, that really helps as we push out re-architecting components, is using that along with obviously Harness to validate that we haven't introduced anything new and any problems. Secondly is a distributed transaction tracing and that end-to-end flow mapping. As we do break monoliths out into more and more components, it becomes a lot harder to easily understand and know how things are going to flow across that environment. And then leveraging AppDynamics to see those flows and then help out and understand, if issues occur, using that data to quickly understand where they are and go ahead and get them resolved.
Great, thanks. This question is one for you, Steve. How is Harness different from Jenkins?
Good question. A
common question we get. If you kind of think of Jenkins as continuous integration, how you build and test code, Harness really picks up where Jenkins left off. So we pick up artifacts and we help customers promote those artifacts through the different environments to customers in production. So, I mean, Ron kind of walked you through how he's using Jenkins in the CI part of the CI/CD puzzle. We actually use Jenkins internally at Harness, and so Jenkins is probably the most common CI tool we integrate with. If that makes sense.
Great, thanks. So that's all the questions we have in the queue right now, although we still have some time, so I want to give the audience a little bit more time. So in the meantime, there's a Resource Center widget that's on the left side of your screen. When we do close the webinar, the screen's going to change to go to the survey. So if you want to click through to any of those resources, now would be a good time. And let me see. Here's a question that came through. I want to say it's for Tom, but it could also be for Steve. So this person is fairly new to AppD and does not have Harness. For the use case of identifying the dependent systems for a specific system, how did that integration take place? Is it AppDynamics specific API or Harness APIs that hit AppDynamics database? Did you engage AppDynamics to help in this or your own consultant?
We're best friends is the short answer. So Harness did the integration with AppD.
Yeah, and just in terms of those APIs, there are REST APIs that you can go and use to go and retrieve data from the AppDynamics controller.
Great, thanks. Okay. All right, another question for Tom. Is AppDynamics able to integrate with other tools?
Absolutely. We do have other integrations out there. I don't want to start talking about a bunch of other vendors on a webinar that we're doing specifically on Harness. But we do have a number of other integrations out there. They are typically going ahead and either we're leveraging REST APIs from other people, or they're leveraging our APIs to go and build those integrations. The one thing I will add is if you search for us on GitHub, a lot of the integrations that we built are available up there or through the AppDynamics website.
Okay, great, thanks. There's another question here, but I think we will take it offline. And so if there are no other, although the question that is in the chat, that came in through the chat and wanted us to just keep it offline, if you could be a little bit more specific with your question, that'll help us with the additional follow-up. But if there are no other questions, or even if you think of questions afterwards, you can definitely send us a note at webinars@appdynamics.com. And okay, I think, yes, that is pretty much, that is the end of the Q&A portion. I guess to Ron and Steve and Tom, do you guys have any other closing thoughts you want to share? Let's start with you, Ron.
Thank you, Alyssa. I think one thing that I'd like to share is just from a personal perspective, that when we were getting started, there was a lot of, oh, we can't do that. It's going to be too hard. We don't know how to do that. And pressing on through that uncertainty was very rewarding, because not only were we able to do it, but it helped us break down the barriers in how we were thinking about approaching future projects as well. So incrementally, each one of our challenges has become even more sizable because we've got the courage and the fortitude to bear through with it. So it's something about a mentality change that you can adopt as well that then makes these things easy. The technologies are out there. The people who know how to use the technologies are out there. So you can do it. It doesn't matter what age your code base is or how you're hosted. There's nothing between you and where you want to be except for yourself.
Great, Ron, and thanks again for sharing your story. Steve, any closing thoughts for you? or maybe not. Tom?
Nothing really to add. I think I would add everyone's comments. I think I've been around some of this red change and CI/CD space for a while in previous roles, and it's no matter how hard you think it might be, you can take baby steps and you're going to get them solved.
Awesome, great. So again, I want to thank the audience for your time today, and to our speakers, thank you so much for presenting this great content. And so with that, if there are no other, or there's a few other questions that did come through, and we'll answer those offline, so you'll be hearing from us. If not myself, then somebody from the team will answer. So again, thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.